Olá, bem-vindas e bem-vindos. Eu sou a Mariana Almeida e este é o McKinsey Talks, direto do estúdio da McKinsey em São Paulo. O tema de hoje é a transição para o carbono neutro na América Latina e no mundo. Este episódio é o segundo da série Sustentabilidade e a Nova Economia Verde. Um relatório lançado recentemente pela McKinsey mostra que a transição para uma economia de carbono neutro exigirá 275 trilhões de dólares em investimentos. E para falar sobre esses enormes desafios e oportunidades, temos aqui conosco um dos autores do estudo, Sven Smith, que é sócio sênior da McKinsey em Amsterdã e diretor do McKinsey Global Institute, que é o braço de pesquisa sobre negócios e economia da McKinsey. Por isso, nossa conversa hoje será em inglês. Welcome, Sven. We are very happy to have you here.
Hi, Mariana. It's great to be with you.
Para nos dar mais informações sobre a transição na América Latina, temos aqui no estúdio, mais uma vez, Henrique Seotto, sócio da McKinsey em Minas Gerais e líder da prática de sustentabilidade no Brasil. Ele liderou nossos estudos recentes sobre o potencial de hidrogênio verde e do mercado de carbono no Brasil. Olá, Henrique. É sempre um prazer recebê-lo aqui.
Um prazer estar de novo volta, Mariana.
Muito bem. So, let's get started.
Yes.
My first question goes to Sven. Can you tell us a bit about this report on the net zero transition and how it came about?
Yeah, we worked on this report ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. At that time, governments and companies worldwide were continuing to increase their pledges to achieve net zero greenhouse gases, and we're heading towards more than 90% of global GDP committed to net zero. But then when you're committed, the actual question remains is what would it actually take to fulfill that ambition in terms of demand, in terms of cost, in terms of jobs. And so this affects all countries and all sectors directly, but also unevenly. And we basically were studying like, what are these impacts? So we set upon ourselves to basically study this problem. And we worked on what is about 85% of the overall emissions in 69 countries with a 2050 timeframe to just establish what the commitments now would take.
Sven, and what are the main findings of this report?
Well, there are about 6 maybe findings of the report. In a way, this problem cannot be solved if not all countries and all sectors will do their part. We will have to invest an enormous amount to basically build a new energy system and a new production system. It's probably to the tune of $275 trillion until 2050. It's the largest capital reallocation in human history. It's front-loaded. That makes it hard because that means we need to sort of pay ahead of demand and ahead of the returns. And the climatic effects are to some degree even later. So we do something very early for a problem in the long future. It's also very uneven. Developmental economics are very different if you are still wanting to become a consumer of energy and you're not allowed. Lots of jobs, maybe 185 million will be relocated. And by sector, this is very different. While the risks of climate will continue to increase as temperature increases, the preparation of institutions will need to step up, and we're at the moment not yet there to fulfill this. And this will be requiring value chains to be reshaped. It's not just, a car going electric that will make the situation solved, because if the electricity that the car then uses is not green, the car didn't become greener. Actually, in that case, the car became less green because you actually went to the batteries without having the green energy. So it's a very complex problem. It needs many, many actors to get right, and therefore it's hard to achieve. And we need to get many things right to get there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And can we deep dive into these topics, please?
If you go to about the universality, you could divide all the energy and land use systems into 7 major sectors: power, industry, mobility, buildings, agriculture, forestry, and waste. They're highly interdependent. So to achieve the net zero goal, every one of these systems will need to undergo transformation. If only one sector commits and the other not, the transition just won't happen. Take my car example that I just gave. We currently spend a lot of money on energy, about 5.7 trillion annually. I just say 5.7 trillion, that's nearly the entire US economy every year spent on the capex to help us produce energy. And that is now spent on high and low emission assets. We will need to increase that 5.7 trillion by 3.5 trillion on low emission assets and reach a total amount of 9.2 trillion. So that's roughly closer to the entire US economy. It's 7.5% of global GDP for a period until 2050. So that is I could almost say, super large amount of money that almost nobody can comprehend. And this will include shifts from steep declines in demand for coal and oil and gas production, eventually with manufacturing and so on to be reshaped on that. The problem of all of this is it's front-loaded. It's not that you spend the money in conjunction with a return, because the return is not having a runaway climate in the long future. And so we're spending it now. We get energy back, so to some degree you get a return from that. But we're only doing this transition for the climatic effects. So if you actually have this front-loaded amount of money, who is going to pay for that? Because at the moment, the incentives are to just produce the energy that we have with the system that we have. And so we're going to have to spend a lot of money. Do we borrow that? Do we take it away from something else before we then get the returns? So that makes it a very hard question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, these numbers are huge. And Henrique, what would that mean for LATAM?
Well, Mariana, I think first we need to understand that our emissions profile are very different from the rest of the world, right? LATAM is one of the continents that relies mostly on renewable energies. Take Brazil, for example, 85% of our energy matrix is clean. So our challenges are slightly different than the other regions, right? To start with, just quoting the Latin numbers that Sven just mentioned, Latin America, we need to spend about 9.5% of GDP, so it's slightly higher than the average of the world, to achieve the net zero transition, right? This means a total investment of about 0.7 trillion per annum, which is a rise of 75% from current levels, right? So not only the percent is higher, but the step change is also higher for LATAM as well. And the investment will need to span across industries, but the larger share of the investment will come into the agricultural sector. There, the problem is not carbon, it's actually the methane or the nitrox oxide that is emitted by the cattle and by the crops we produce. Transportation, and also the conservation of forests, right? And finally, if we actually the total spending of LATAM is actually very similar to what we call the current policy scenario, right? But it's a substantial shift from low emissions assets. So the current policy considers the commitments that the governments have already done. So that commitment is in line to what we did, but where we're going to invest that money may need a significant shift.
Okay. Thank you very much. So Sven, you mentioned already who's paying for that, but can you detail a little bit this? Who is paying for that, finally?
Yeah, so we, in our work, actually said that to solve the net zero equation, a few things need to still be resolved. And one of the big things is who pays. You could think of many ways to get this paid. When people say we install a carbon market, and the carbon price will settle all of this, at the end of the day, that carbon price will land in the lap of certain participants, at the end of the day, often the consumer and the citizens, for whom certain things will get just much more expensive. And then the consumer pays. Another way to say it is you could sort of tax it in a way that maybe the richer part of the world, the richer part of the population pays. The third way you could do it is we actually say this is a long-term investment. So we think like infrastructure, government invests, it goes through the debt of the government, which would have to increase a lot. The number we're talking about here would basically increase debt to GDP for the world by 100% points. if this would all be debt financed. Then, you know, it could be debt financed not just by the government, but like what happened in COP26, where GFANZ said we will be willing to commit 130 trillion worth of investment. My guess is if this needs to get paid, it will be a little bit of all of the above, because no single sector can pay for all of this. But we then need to be very careful because this could become very uneven.
Okay, so everyone is paying a little bit for this. Right. So, and can you detail the three first characteristics of this transition, please?
Well, the unevenness of this transition is in many ways, I think, the hardest part to solve, because, you know, if who pays can pay it, it's going to be easy. But you could see in Europe, for just 200 euros more price of diesel, you got the yellow vest movement that basically said that's too much for us. We're not talking 200 euros per person. We're talking much more when we talk about the amount of money that we're talking about. But it's uneven in many ways. On the sector side, there's 20% of GDP, the sectors that are representing that basically have the largest part of emissions. It's steel and cement, automotive, and fuels. So for them, this issue is much bigger than for other sectors. And therefore, you know, you get basically a decline in demand for their products, a cost increase, and so on. So complicated. If you then take two countries, certain countries are producers of fossil fuel that they might not sell in the future. So that means they lose a major income stream. There's about 13 countries that would lose a very significant chunk of that. But there's also countries that would like to grow, basically build an energy-driven economy. And those actually then needed to be supported by other countries. And are they going to do that? And then you can go to communities, you know, where jobs will be gained and jobs will be lost. Net, this might be a job gain. Some people suggest that works, and our numbers would be very close to a balance or maybe a slight job gain. Job gains in renewables, but job losses in the traditional sectors. That doesn't mean that the person who works in the traditional sector goes to the new job. And the net result of that might be that there's 185 million people whose jobs are displaced, and 200 million other people get new jobs. And the pain for the 185 could then be substantial. So we're needing to deal with all these issues if we want to get this right.
Okay, so let's hope for the gain of new jobs, right? Henrique, would you explain how that will affect Latin America and Brazil specifically, please?
Certainly. So let's take emissions first, right? The world top 10 emitters, including Brazil, account collectively for about 62% of CO2 emissions, right? Globally, power, mobility, and industry account for about 50% of the GHG emissions. GHG standing for greenhouse gas emissions, okay? So like Sven said, it's very disproportionate. No? So countries and sectors will be affected differently. If we take Latin America actually accounts for a relatively small fraction of the emissions, it's about 5.5%. And we have one of the lowest emissions per capita of about 4 tons of CO2 per capita only, right? So compared to a global average of close to 6, so we're actually 1/3 more efficient than the world. And this comes from our clean energy matrix. Brazil, like I mentioned, is about 85% clean, but you take even Paraguay or Colombia, have much higher share of renewables in their matrix. Also, the difference is where these emissions are coming from. So if you take the example of Brazil, 45% of our emissions come from deforestation. So if we're able to halt that, actually cutting our emissions in half, it becomes relatively easy, right? It's about controlling deforestation. And also the remaining of if you take the 45%, the other 30% are related to agriculture, in which Brazil, it's mainly coming from cattle because of ethanic fermentation from cattle, and coming from the nitrous oxide that is emitted by the fertilizers in crop agriculture, right? Brazil and Argentina are the largest producers of meat and one of the largest producers of meat and crop globally. And we actually already have very sustainable practices. So it's about using that which we already used to do and taking it a step up to be able to decarbonize those sectors, right? The transition exposure is a bit different, right? Most of the Latin America transition exposure is close to global averages. So in that way, we're kind of in the middle of the crop as a continent. But if we actually go down to specific countries, our exposure may vary between 25 and 45 or 50% of the GDP, depending on the country. So to Sven's point, we actually start to see that differentiation when we look into specific countries, right? And even though we have a lower GDP per capita, we are also the ones who are going to need to invest more, right? Like I mentioned before, we're going to have to invest about 9.5% of our GDP to be able to tackle this transition. And some of our countries are going to receive a double burden, right? In which they're exposed both to the transition risk and having to spend more to enable that transition. So when those are the countries and regions we need to be very careful about.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much. And Sven, can you elaborate more on the transition risk, please?
Yeah, so I think, we are doing all of this because of the climate risk. And if the transition is delayed, that climate risk could get bigger. At the same time, if this were super easy and there were no transition risk, we would have already done it. We would have already spent the money and so on. Well, it's not easy because there's a lot of money, but actually also real transition risks that we need to take into account. And if you don't fully take them into account, you're going to be looking at this too easily and not take the appropriate actions. So I mentioned the workers. If you do it too abrupt, the displacement of workers could lead to what we saw in the globalization efforts, where a town like Detroit, lost a lot of jobs to the transition of production, and that could be painful. If you go very fast, then a lot of stranded assets might occur that basically are prematurely retired because you basically shut down a coal plant much earlier than its useful life, which is expensive or a negative. Another big risk, which I see that we are maybe experiencing right now, is that if you don't build the low emission activities fast and you take the fossil fuel, for example, down fast, you actually could be in a situation that you don't have enough energy supply and you get to very high energy prices, which are very painful to lots of people. I will add to this in this context that we are in right now with the Ukraine, that you can also look at it this way, that if we don't have alternatives for energy coming from somebody else, and we have a supply disruption, we just might be short energy, which is very painful. And I think something we cannot permit ourselves to go to. And as a result, you could get high market prices, you get financial asset displacement and bankruptcies and so on. And I'm not saying this to make it all more complex, but the reality is this is one of the largest capital reallocations on the planet and an enormous transition of one of the most important systems to our economy. The idea that this would all be easy, I think is underdoing the challenge that we're facing. And therefore we found it useful to call out these significant transition risks so they become part of the conversation when we make the proper decisions on how to make this happen.
Many people say this transition is the greatest challenge of our generation, but it also brings huge opportunities ahead. Would you give us more details on that, please?
Well, clearly, anyone who builds alternatives and the innovation around that could actually bring on huge benefits to society. Whether that's energy in a renewable sense, whether it's maybe all the research that's happening around different nuclear technologies that are maybe coming back, including nuclear fusion, they are accelerated due to this pressure. And maybe it's possible that we actually end up in a situation where we will have energy abundance. And one thing that would be beautiful for life is that you have energy abundance, because energy is actually the rate limiter to much of what we do. From low carbon products, you can actually create new things that we would have not gotten to. Maybe over time, we will feel that an electric car is just a superior vehicle to a combustion action. And in the same time, it does the thing that we need to do from a climate perspective. But to me, it's an interesting question whether we would ever get into an electrical car if we didn't have this challenge. Now, long debates on what's the optimal. And then, there's lots of new technologies and materials that need to be made for this transition. But as we do that, those materials might maybe also be applied to other areas. If you build good batteries for the energy transition, maybe those batteries allow us to power regions in the world that we couldn't power without those batteries. And so to me, if you have a very large level of innovation, lots of new things will develop, lots of new technologies develop, and every time that has happened, also completely surprising results have occurred.
And I can quote a few examples even to Latin America, right? For example, Latin America, take Brazil, Chile, Argentina, have very cheap solar and wind energy, right? So we can actually use this to export green energy in the form of green hydrogen, right? This is a whole new value chain that is about to form, and there's a lot of interest in bringing this to the country. You probably saw in the news many MOUs being signed by companies interested in producing renewables in Brazil to create hydrogen, right? We can also use that energy to create green products. There are a lot of energy-intensive products that right now use fossil fuel, take steel, take aluminum, for example, where Brazil could actually produce them at very low or close to zero carbon and use it to export and help other economies decarbonize, right? There's also other like consumer products. We talk about protein, for example. There's a lot of push on alternative protein or plant-based protein, which is growing very fast. But at the same time, to think that we need to give access to protein to about 8 billion people, right? Maybe the easiest path is actually to decarbonize the beef value chain, right? We have the technology. If you actually think about the integration between crop, forestry, and pasture that Embrapa has developed, that by itself can cut carbon emissions by close to 50%, right? And that's just one lever. So the region in Brazil specifically have a lot of opportunities on those value chains. And finally, the whole carbon markets, right? The world will need carbon capture to happen. The technologies to capture carbon technologically, like literally taking it out of industrial processes or the air and sinking it into geological formations, for example, it's very expensive. The cheapest path is actually to use what we call natural-based solutions. That is related to reforestation, afforestation, recovery of mangroves, for example. And again, Brazil and Latin America have about 25% of the world's opportunity regarding those value chains. So it's very rich in opportunities, especially for Latin America.
That's great to know. Very rich indeed. So the upcoming decade will be decisive. What actions can stakeholders consider driving an orderly transition to net zero, Sven?
Yeah, so I think across companies, governments, and institutions, it is of paramount importance that these problems that we identified as not solved yet, like who pays, are actually settled in the right way. And that the scale of the buildup of the new is actually ahead of the build down of the old. And if you just take those 2 points, there's 7 other things that are not fully solved. We need to get to a solution for that, because if a functioning economy doesn't have the parameters at which to operate, it can't get this work done. Then within that, if that's set, every company needs to plan on how to get there. What are the plans? What's the optimal solution for their industry, for their business? How does that work from a financing perspective and so on? And it needs to become part of the integral decision-making of companies to get the net zero equation right. But I do believe that we should not escape from solving the 2 or 3 problems that have not been solved that are conditional to get this solution done. Because otherwise we'll just run after a train and find out later that the transition risks were actually too painful to consume. And we are experiencing at this moment an energy shock due to the Ukraine. And to me, there's some valuable lessons from that on just how important a well-functioning energy market is. So as you do this and you move towards the future, you want to make sure that you have a healthy energy economy in the short term. So, because otherwise we'll never be able to get there. You know, if we don't have energy now, we will not have the energy to get to the future.
Okay, so we are unfortunately heading to the end of our session. So Henrique, would you like to add anything?
Just to reinforce the opportunity, to Sven's point, energy is critical, and Latin America has the ability to produce very cheap, clean energy, and that creates a lot of opportunities, either in products or even the export of energy itself in the form of hydrogen. And I believe that society and governments need to prepare for this new global energy flows and green product flows that are going to emerge. We need regulations, we need the right incentives in place to enable this to happen.
Great, thank you. Sven, do you have a final message to leave?
I think we need to take this very seriously, collectively, look at it optimistically, but actually tackle the hard problems. And I think that just takes leadership, and I hope we have it.
Okay, thank you very much. For those who want to read more about the actions of different stakeholders, Sven and other colleagues have written an article on this, which is available on our website. So thank you very much, Sven and Henrique, for your time and for your insights today. Muito obrigada também a você que nos acompanha em vídeo ou em podcast. E se você quiser ler o estudo completo sobre a transição para o carbono neutro, acesse o nosso site www.mckinsey.com.br. Para entrar em contato com os nossos especialistas, nosso e-mail é mckinsey-talks@mckinsey.com. Você também pode enviar perguntas para o próximo episódio desta série, que será sobre o potencial de liderança do Brasil no mercado voluntário de carbono internacional. Participe! A agenda completa do McKinsey Talks está no mckinseytalks.com. Lá você também pode conferir este episódio e os anteriores em vídeo ou em podcast. É isso aí, muito obrigada e até a próxima!